Yes, let's talk about the Entertainment Software Association. And particularly as it relates to the quote that you mentioned and how they use the word trust. Recently, and by recently I mean over the weekend, the ESA, who is responsible obviously for this loot box summit, and also the organization that runs E3, they leaked a spreadsheet that contained the personal information, contact information, personal addresses of over 2,000 games journalists, and other content creators, not just journalists. The spreadsheet was leaked, and it was found that had been published and publicly accessible on the E3 website for who knows how long. And so I'm just going to kind of run quickly through how this developed, because I think that will also be part of our conversation. This obviously impacted a lot of people, over 2,000 journalists and content creators, and to varying degrees, freelancers who were more likely to put their personal addresses as opposed to their company's addresses in the spreadsheet, and when they registered for E3, were obviously impacted, perhaps more so than staff writers who write for publications. Journalists were receiving death threats, calls, and texts more than they receive normally, from very angry people in gaming, quote unquote gamers. You could call them consumers, whatever you want to call them. And the existence of the document was first made public, at least, by a journalist named Sophia Narwitz. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Maybe Narwitz. I'll just call her Narwitz. She publicized the document in a YouTube video that she posted to her personal channel on Friday. And she basically in the video described how people could access the file. She published the video after she had already reached out to the ESA to make sure that the document was down before she published it. And the ESA had said that they took the link off of the site. But even despite that, there was a cached version of the page that people could download the spreadsheet from. So the spreadsheet was still alive even as she had posted the video. She had also reached out to journalists who had, a few of whom, in this Kotaku article written by Maddie Myers, a few of whom mentioned that they did not want Sophia Narwitz to publish the video for reasons that we'll talk about. And so eventually the file was taken down, the link was taken down, but obviously a lot of damage had already been done. And the ESA released a statement to Kotaku, which I'll read out in full here, and obviously it connects to the quote you had read, Luke, about your story about trust. But the ESA's explanation for this was, quote, ESA was made aware of a website vulnerability that led to the contact list of registered journalists attending E3 being made public. It once notified, we immediately took steps to protect that data and shut down the site, which is no longer available. We regret this occurrence and have put measures in place to ensure it will not occur again, unquote. And then this is per Maddie Myers' words, but the ESA representative again declined to respond to Kotaku's other questions about why the file was not properly password protected, how long the file had been available to the public, and whether this was the way that journalists' personal data had been treated by the organization in past years. So those are questions we still do not have answers to, as far as I can tell. This is a pretty major story for the ESA, for E3, and for journalists and the industry in general. It hits on a lot of topics we've talked about, I think, in the past, about the relationship between journalists and the people they write for. So before we dive into that stuff, let me just first get your loose thoughts on this, your overall thoughts. What were your first thoughts upon hearing about this story?
It may be terrible, but I guess I'm to the point where I just don't really react to these things anymore. It just seems like company after company after company is just so incompetent that I just need to assume that if my information's been given to anybody, they're going to screw up sooner or later. And that's not to say that I don't think we should hold them accountable or anything. It's just I was more like, again, really? I hope they get $125 out of it, because no one's going to be held accountable.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, my first thought when I saw it was, oh well, this is going to be an absolute shit show, because and the $125 thing Larry just mentioned, obviously about the Equifax leak. And I actually talked about the Equifax leak on the PvA Nightly Rundown on Monday in relation to this story, because that's the leaking of sensitive information that is impossible to change. And for a lot of these freelancers, while yes, it is completely within the realm of possibility that they may move, it is completely unreasonable to expect somebody to move because of this. And like it is causing irreparable damage to these freelancers who have had their information leaked. Like, and just, I mean, it's easier to change your phone number, but there's a massive amount of inconvenience that goes around with that, especially for professionals who work from home and are, so reliant on being able to connect with other people in the industry. To change your phone number and have to, signal blast that out to the people it matters to is just as hard. And so my first thought was it's a shit show. My second thought was like, what was the function of this spreadsheet, and why did it need to be hosted online? Like, I've been thinking about this for a while of just like, what would the function be of a spreadsheet living online like this in the day where we have like password protected Google Sheets where you can just give your people with an @esa.org email address access to the list if it needs to be accessed. Like, the existence of the list to begin with makes absolutely no sense to me. So
yeah, the public nature of it makes no sense to me. I can understand if you want to give access to like publishers or people who will be at the show so that they can reach out to journalists and like blast them with PR messages. That's normal stuff. And that would be locked behind, like you said, a password protected account, any number of measures put in place to refrain the general public from getting access to it. I don't understand why your home address needs to be on it. That seems like an odd piece of information to be a part of this, other than the fact that like obviously staff writers will have their publications address on there, but that's publicly available regardless. You don't need to have that in this spreadsheet.
I'm wondering if there's some sort of like pre-E3 press kits that go out to some of these.
There probably
places,
is, but I feel like there's probably something you can do that by blasting out a mass email. It doesn't need to be put into one central hub. Obviously, that'd be easier.
Yeah.
But again, if it wasn't publicly accessible in the first place, that would also be easier.
Well, and it almost seems like a side skirting of, a cutting of some corners, because, and we talked about this when Sony backed out of E3, that it left a ton of room open on the show floor, and there was a lot more smaller companies that were coming in, and maybe it was just the ESA being like, well, we don't want to go through all the hassle, so we're just going to try to create a back-end page where these smaller creators can get access, because otherwise we'd have to get all their email addresses, share out access via that email address, yada, yada, yada. Whereas if we can just create a backdoor portal and hope that nobody finds it, then that'll be fine, It's just a strange and stupid move on anyone's part, but it's like Larry said, like, people don't understand the value of the personal information that they're being given and the measures that they need to take in order to handle that responsibly.
Yeah, this is just sheer incompetence. So I want to preface all of my thoughts before this by saying this obviously hits close to home for me because I am a journalist, and my contact information I give out to a lot of people, the people who I want to contact. If my email address and everything was publicly accessible, my home address was publicly accessible, I would worry. And these people, like a lot of the people on this list already endure a ton of harassment online just through Twitter, but you can block people on that. It's more difficult when it's coming to your cell phone, coming to your personal address, and people know where you live. It's just like the stories that were coming out of this of people crying because they were receiving death threats, people's significant others crying because they were receiving death threats. That stuff is just not acceptable. And this is like this goes beyond sheer incompetence. This is like just active stupidity that should have been noted by an organization that for some reason wields as much name recognition and power as it does in the industry. Like the ESA, we've mentioned the ESA countless times on this podcast for any number of things, from the loot box conference to this and E3. It's just absurd that an organization of that size and notability would make a mistake like this. And yeah, maybe it's naive of me to think companies like this leak information all the time, but when it will have as much of an impact as this will have on the industry, I think we should take them to task for it, because journalists are a large reason that E3 is the thing it is. Journalists are covering this thing constantly, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the effect this will have on E3 in general is going to be very interesting to note.
Yeah. Well, and talking about some of the stories that have come out of this leak, I think equally as stupid are the number of stories I saw from people who were like, hey, I understand you're trying to be encouraging, but can you please stop texting my personal number with your encouraging messages? Like, how fucking stupid do people have to be? Like, I don't answer the phone when a random number calls me, and I rarely answer if a random number texts me. Like, I don't care if your message is a death threat or is a positive, like, hey, we're thinking about you, be safe in this time. Like, if you don't know the person and they didn't give you their number, like, don't fucking text them. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
I hadn't even seen those. That is so weird.
Yeah, it's an interesting take.
It's somebody trying to get their foot in and hoping to become a friend with, one of these creators. That's what it is. And it's just as creepy and just as dangerous.
Yeah.
I do want to quickly address Sophia Narwitz's decision in the first place to publicize this. I think this is an interesting point of conversation, because I saw a lot of conversation going around about the lack of responsibility about publicizing how to access the document. Obviously, she was trying to inform people who were on the list so that they could be aware of it. And she had obviously assumed she had taken all the steps to realize that the link was down and that people couldn't access it anymore. She believed that to be the case. But what do you guys think about her decision to publicize this the way she did, or even publicize it in the first place?
I think publicizing that it was possible to do this was a good and necessary thing.
Yes.
Maybe the step-by-step here's how wasn't good. But even that, like, once you say, hey, this can be done, like, there are people savvy enough to, I don't know that it would have made a difference in the grand scheme of things if she'd kept it vague, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, once someone knows there's a vulnerability, they're going to figure it out. So, I don't know.
Well, and I think that she was under the impression that this was going to be leaked anyway. Like, had it on good authority that it was going to be coming out regardless. And I think that, I don't know. It popped off says in the chat, got to get those clicks. And, I think that that's a lot of what people are feeling about this. But I also think that you have a responsibility within this. I mean, she did her due diligence to try to make sure that it was not publicly accessible. But what showing how easy it was to access does is it allows us to recognize the sheer incompetence of the ESA and place the blame where it's duly supposed to be placed. Whereas if this would have just been leaked and the story comes out later on that, like, oh, this thing, somebody else yada yada leaked it, then it becomes about the person that actually leaked it with, like, ill intent, rather than the conversation we're having now about, like, how fucking stupid of the ESA to just have a link on a random page that gave you this. So I don't know. I understand the criticism, especially from the people who were impacted by it. But if you believe it's going to come out anyway, and you've done your due diligence to make sure following these steps is not going to get you to it now, and following those steps didn't get them to it then in the first place, you still had to go in and get the cached version of the sites in order to pull it down. So I don't know. I get the criticism, but I don't share it.
Yeah, I think she obviously weighed the pros and cons of this probably pretty heavily. And I don't know her background as a journalist or as a content creator, to be honest. But I do think I tend to agree. this probably would have come out at some point within the next 2 days over the weekend. She seems to definitely believe that was the case, which leads me to believe that it probably was the case. And so I think I think it probably does more good to reveal to people what was happening. Like you said, that to raise eyebrows of people who are on the list and who aren't on the list to what the ESA hasn't done or has done. I also think it was good of her to reach out to journalists in advance to make them aware. Obviously, as many as she was aware of and could notify. That was a great step to take. I think this is one of those things where she would have gotten backlash regardless, and there would have been pros and cons to whatever decision she made, and ultimately she did choose to publicize, and more people are aware of it as a result. People were still impacted by it. I don't think she could have avoided that from happening, but I think ultimately she made the best of two probably very shitty choices. But what I do think is worth talking about here, at least for a little bit, is the question I'm going to pose has a very simple answer. And it's one we've talked about before, but I think it's worth discussing again, basically because of how absolutely clear in the sand this incident drew a distinction between journalists and gamers. My question is, how does this incident point to broader tensions between journalists and gamers? And I think it's probably pretty clear how it kind of makes those distinctions clear and those fault lines very clear. But I'm curious on your guys' behalf, or on your guys' side. We've talked at length about how about Gamergate, about how journalists are bombarded with a lot of harassment, how developers are bombarded with harassment from a very particular segment of the gaming population. I think this incident in particular makes it very clear how far of a divide there is between journalists and at least part of the people that they're writing for.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to say anything enlightening or particularly new with this, but I think number one, there is a complete and utter misunderstanding of the roles that journalists play within the grand scheme of the gaming industry, and that oftentimes gamers take out their frustrations on it. It's a shoot the messenger kind of deal in a lot of ways. And you think back to stories like the No Man's Sky delay and Jason breaking that story, Jason Schreier my good pal Jason breaking that story, Jason Schreier from Kotaku, and the amount of shit that he got over just reporting on a story with no bias at all.
No, just
reporting the facts, and just because it hadn't been confirmed yet, the amount of shit that he got, and in the whole meme of oh well, Jason Schreier delayed No Man's Sky, but and yes, that is a meme, but it is representative of the fact that people do not understand the function of journalists and personalities in the gaming industry, and oftentimes take their frustrations out on these people in very extreme and vitriolic ways.
Yeah. I also just think there's a very combative relationship, at least on one side, because I think the job of journalists is to report on the facts. And oftentimes those facts do not jibe with the rose-colored view of a franchise or a game that a lot of people have. And it can oftentimes, journalism is very critical. It's the job of journalists to be honest and to be as objective as you can be, and often that requires a critical perspective on a topic. Fandom is critical, but it's also extremely blindly accepting of things regardless of their faults. And so when journalists come in and start quote unquote criticizing something, fandoms take that as an offense, and they automatically put up their guard and become extremely defensive and oftentimes very hostile. And so I think that dynamic is obviously clearly has been at play, and developers are not great at we've talked about this with Mordhau. They're not exactly great at repressing or kind of controlling that behavior, they oftentimes weaponize the passion of their fan base and just kind of shrug it off. So there's a lot of dynamics here at play, but this incident just kind of reveals those fault lines. Again, nothing new.
And it's not just a gaming thing either. It's like there is a general atmosphere of beating up on the journalists is a popular and okay thing right now.
Especially now, yeah, definitely.
And so in a lot of ways, it's that. I kind of, while you guys were talking, I was thinking back to Luke earlier mentioning the texting a journalist, be like, "Hey man, I know this time is rough for you," and I think that's part of the issue too. Is we live in such a connected age, and there are these opportunities to engage online with people, and have conversations, and sometimes we mistake the capacity to connect with the forging of a relationship. And so I could spend a lot of time watching somebody and reading their content and feel like I know them, and not realize that it's kind of creepy for me to cross that line and start communicating with them as though we are good friends who have spent hours together.
Yeah.
I think some people need to think through that.
That happens with my job because we work for a relatively small local paper. People have a sense of their relationship with the paper and with us as reporters. And so there is kind of I think I have a very different perception of my relationship with the readers than they do with me. And so you definitely see that. I think that definitely plays a role in it as well. There's a twisted version of the relationship, or I guess not twisted, but distorted or different perceptions of it. And there's a sense of entitlement that comes with being able to lord over that content.
Yeah. Well, in the relationship, I think is kind of distinct in the gaming space because gaming fandom often becomes the story in these situations. So it's like a cyclical kind of thing where news breaks, gamers react in a negative way. The negative reaction receives the coverage, and it's just this loop. Like, and you know, you use the word combative, but I do think that there is, and we've talked about this off air. And forgive me if I'm publicizing something, but how oftentimes we, as people who, in a very minor way, cover this industry, how often we're like, God, we hate the people that make this industry up because of the shit we've got to cover, the shit we've got to talk about, you know? And I can just, and you can tell from following particular personalities on Twitter that that's the way they feel about it too. Like, they love games as a hobby. They love games as an industry and the people creators that they get to interact with. But when it comes down to the fandom, it just sucks to be to have to deal with. And so it becomes combative in a cyclical way. And I'm not saying in any way that justifies any of the responses that we're getting, but it's the nature of just kind of what has been boiling up over, I would say, the last few years, especially within games coverage.
Definitely. And it's disappointing. It's made me question whether I want to do it full time. I'd be fine doing it freelance, but would I really want to write for an audience? And I should say, like, we're generalizing here. Obviously, these are the loudest voices, and there are people I've interacted with a lot of readers who like my work and have genuinely enlightening conversations with me about it. But there is undeniably a not insignificant portion of the audience that is reacting this way. And I think it's even harder for reporters of color and for reporters who are women or female identifying who have to face this stuff. It's even more difficult, especially when they can target you with having all your contact information.
Yep. Having seen what my wife deals with just being a woman on the internet, I can't imagine being a woman speaking critically about something in an official capacity on the internet.
Yeah. It's tough.
And, you know, this isn't really gaming industry. This gets beyond that. But I told Luke this in a conversation this week. Just, I wish there'd be a big crackdown on this kind of thing. Like, if you make a death threat through the internet, like, you should go to jail. Like, it shouldn't be handled like, oh, some guy just got mad on the internet. Like, throw a few people in jail. And I think some of this will get some people to think twice. Not that it'll solve the problem, but it might dissipate some of it. Like right now, I feel like I could, not that I would, I feel like I could get on the internet and just send a death threat to somebody and nothing's going to come of it, except I might get blocked on a social media platform. And it should be a lot more serious than that.
Yeah. And speaking of repercussions, that gives me a perfect segue.
You're welcome.
I want to talk about the repercussions that you guys think this will have, both for the ESA as an organization, but also for E3 as an event, because obviously the ESA organizes E3. They're inextricably linked with it. What do you think the repercussions will be for the ESA as an organization? We'll begin there, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's already lawsuits being gathered together,
pending legal action.
And I think that it is going to be a not insignificant amount of money that will have to be paid out in order to make this right, because it is a very defined group of individuals. It's not millions and millions like the Equifax thing. It's a defined group of individuals who have had their information compromised, and it is going to require significant life change in order to feel safe and comfortable again. And so there is pain and suffering costs to be recouped there. And I think that the ESA is going to take a massive lump in having to pay back, hopefully, in damages that they have caused through their negligence. And I don't know much about the infrastructure and the health of the ESA, but I know that oftentimes with E3, the finances of E3 comes up as a topic of conversation in terms of its viability. And so if it doesn't impact the ESA at large in a way that would result in its demise, I can easily see it resulting in E3's demise.
Yeah.
Which at this point, who cares?
Yeah.
Like,
an interesting point I saw someone bring up, and this relates to your point about legal action. Obviously, I think a lot of journalists involved in this have talked about pending legal action. What's interesting to me was that a few people were mentioning something called the GDPR. I don't know if you guys know what this is. The General Data Protection Regulation, which is an EU law. Obviously, the ESA is an American organization, but the effect of this does impact European individuals. And people were talking about the possibility for repercussions based on that law in particular. Because it does extend to individuals who are affected by something, even if it's not within the borders of the EU, which would be another pretty hefty hit for the ESA.
Yeah, so with what I do for a living, we have to consider GDPR, especially for...
oh, great. Perfect.
Especially if we have clients that are marketing to international international customers and try. So the GDPR is a protection on data collection. So if I have a form that I want you to fill out to download something, and I'm asking for your email address and your phone number. Number one, I have to be able to justify the information that I'm asking for, and number two, I have to be able to provide a baseline level of protections for that information, and that's where the ESA is going to fall into some trouble because they didn't provide that baseline level of protection for people's submitted personal information. And those things, we turn people away at our agency if it's going to be too GDPR heavy, because it's a headache, and as an agency, you are not cleared from as like a third party acting for them if something were to go wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm just super cynical right now. I'm at a place in life where I've watched legal action fail again and again and again and again. And so I kind of hope that they're held accountable in a significant way. But I'm also sitting here like, if unchangeable personal information is worth $125 a pop, like you and I sitting here, like reasonably, we recognize like it's going to cost a lot more than that for these people to feel safe again. But will a court recognize that? Will the law play out that way? And I'm not optimistic. I feel like they'll get some financial slap on the wrist and we'll all move on. And I sincerely hope I'm wrong. I'm kind of cynical in this area right now.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. And I do think that a lot of that cynicism is probably well deserved. How do you guys think this will impact E3 next year?
I mean, I've talked about the financial repercussions already, but there's also the trust factor. And with journalists and other
People have already
personalities. And
started saying they don't want to. They're not going to go.
yeah, well, and I think Jason Schreier tweeted like, "How is anybody going to be able to ever trust you with our personal information again?" You know, and like you said earlier, Cody, E3 is E3 because of its coverage, and if you can't get people through and it's not just GameSpot's coverage and IGN's coverage and coverage from these outlets where it's a company address. It is this industry is being more and more driven by personalities on the internet, and you're not getting it from these outlets. You're getting it from the one singular voice that you trust. And I think that there are going to be plenty of people who will jump at the opportunity of going to E3 regardless of how at risk it puts their personal information. But I think some of the bigger names are going to have to take pause and say, is this something that I really can trust the ESA to protect? And I think you're going to see a lot of people who say no, they can't, and that's going to have a massive impact.
Yeah, so I agree, and assuming that my cynicism is wrong, if they're hit financially, like it does seem like E3 is just kind of limping along, and I think that could be the death blow. If you have these big names pull out, which is a real possibility, then that could kill it. If both of these things happen, like I'd be very worried about the future of E3. But I'm not sure how it's going to play out.
Yeah,
and we'll definitely see them like really doing the good marketing. Oh, look at all these reasons you can trust us.
Yeah, they're going to be definitely pushing the trust button a lot. I think it's interesting because we had talked, I think, around E3 or a little bit before about is E3 dead or is E3 over? Just with Sony pulling out and a bunch of other places, a bunch of other big names starting to pull out from the developer and publisher side. I think this definitely does not dissuade our like warning shots about that stuff. I think we all agreed that E3 this was just kind of a weird year for E3 in general because of where it falls in the console cycle. But if a bunch of big names from both the publisher, developer, and press side start pulling out of E3, you're right. That's a death blow.
Yeah. Can't have E3 without the people who make the industry go round.
Exactly. It'll just be a bunch of gamers standing around twiddling their thumbs.
They're going to be like, come to E3, we're going to have the world's biggest loot box workshop.
Now, if you've always wanted to go to E3, this is probably the year.
That's true.
Tons of availability, guys.